Sometimes, the smallest words can break the biggest hearts. When 18-year-old Eva whispered, "I'm not worth much, sir," to cattle baron Silas Merrick, she had no idea those 6 words would change both their lives forever. In the dusty frontier town of Marrow Creek, 60-year-old Silas had built an empire on silence and stone-faced pride. His wealth was legendary, his land vast, but his heart had grown cold after losing his daughter years before. Then Eva arrived, a freedwoman covered in trail dust and old wounds, asking only for honest work. What started as a simple request for employment became something deeper. As the seasons changed, so did they both. Eva found her worth, and Silas discovered that redemption sometimes comes in the quietest moments. But would a town built on unspoken rules ever allow an unlikely bond between a powerful rancher and a young woman society deemed completely worthless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this beautiful story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extra special for you. The morning sun painted Marrow Creek in shades of amber and dust, casting long shadows across the main street where merchants were already setting up their wares. Silas Merrick stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, a structure that commanded respect, not just for its size, but for what it represented. 30 years of shrewd cattle trading, land acquisition, and the kind of stubborn determination that built empires in unforgiving territory. At 60, Silas carried himself with the bearing of a man who had never backed down from a fight, though the fights these days were mostly with memories. His hands, weathered from decades of ranch work, before wealth allowed him to delegate such tasks, wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since grown cold. The silver pocket watch in his vest, a gift from his daughter Margaret on his 50th birthday, ticked steadily against his chest, marking time he no longer seemed to notice. The Merrick Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, with the Bighorn Mountains providing a majestic backdrop that never failed to stir something deep in those who saw it for the first time. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered brown stones, tended by a crew of 8 men who had worked for Silas long enough to read his moods in the set of his shoulders. "Boss, them cattle in the north pasture need moving before the weather turns," called Tom Henley, his foreman of 15 years, as he approached the porch. Tom was a lean man with graying temples and the kind of steady gaze that came from a lifetime of honest work. He had been there through the good years and the devastating one 5 years ago when everything changed. Silas nodded without looking. "Away from the horizon. Take Jake and Domingo with you. That north fence line needs checking too. Saw some loose posts yesterday." Tom hesitated, hat in his hands. "You eaten anything today, boss?" "Cookies got biscuits and gravy ready in the lee bunkhouse." "I'm fine, Tom." It was the same conversation they had most mornings, a gentle dance around the truth that Silas barely ate enough to keep a bird alive these days. Tom had watched his employer transform from a robust man who could work alongside his hands from dawn to dusk into someone who seemed to be slowly disappearing, even as his wealth continued to grow. The town of Marrow Creek lay 3 miles southeast of the ranch, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown up around the railroad depot, and the promise of prosperity that the tracks represented. Main Street boasted a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a white-steepled church where Reverend Samuel Morrison preached to a congregation that included both the wealthiest ranchers and the humblest sodbusters in the territory. Silas owned half the businesses in town, though he rarely visited anymore except for necessary transactions. His presence was still felt, though, in the respectful nods he received, the way conversations paused when he entered a room, and the careful deference shown by men who owed their livelihoods to his investments and goodwill. But respect built on money and power was a cold thing, and Silas had learned that lesson the hard way. It couldn't buy back words never spoken, apologies never offered, or the love of a daughter who had died believing her father cared more about his reputation than her happiness. Margaret had been 23 when the fever took her, married to a schoolteacher from Denver that Silas had never quite approved of. Not because David wasn't a good man, he was decent, educated, kind, but because he wasn't the kind of husband Silas had envisioned for his only child. He had wanted someone who could help expand the family business, someone with connections and ambition, someone who could understand what it meant to build something lasting. The last conversation between father and daughter had been about money, of course. Margaret had asked for help with David's medical bills. He had been injured in a fall and couldn't work for months. Silas had offered to pay, but with conditions. David would come work for him, learn the cattle business, forget about teaching children to read poetry and history. It was a practical solution, Silas had thought, a way to secure their future. Margaret had looked at him with eyes that held both disappointment and a weary kind of resignation. "I'm not worth much to you, am I, Papa? Not unless I'm part of your plans." Those words haunted him now, especially in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep eluded him and the past pressed close like an unwelcome visitor. She had left his office that day, taking David to Denver for treatment, and Silas had never seen her again. The letter about her death had arrived on a Tuesday, written in David's careful script. "She spoke of you often, sir. Even at the end, she hoped you might find your way to forgiveness, both of her choices and your own." The funeral had been small, held in Denver where she had made her life. Silas had stood at the back of the church, a stranger among her friends, listening to stories about a woman he realized he had never really known. His daughter, who had taught Sunday school to immigrant children, who had organized food drives for struggling families, who had possessed a generous heart that he had never fully appreciated. Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, the banker's widow, had taken it upon herself to check on Silas in the months following Margaret's death. She would arrive with casseroles and gentle conversation, settling into the parlor as if she belonged there. She was a handsome woman of 55 with steel gray hair and intelligent brown eyes, and under different circumstances, Silas might have welcomed her attention. "You're wasting away, Silas," she had told him just last month, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had buried her own spouse and understood grief's particular cruelties. "Margaret wouldn't want this for you. She'd want you to live, to find purpose again." But purpose felt like a luxury Silas could no longer afford. The ranch ran itself through the competence of good men like Tom Henley. The businesses in town generated steady income without requiring his daily oversight. His wealth grew while his world shrank, and most days he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The hands respected him but kept their distance, sensing the wall he had built around himself. The townspeople sought his opinion on matters of commerce and development, but their interactions remained formal, transactional. Even Reverend Morrison, who had known Silas for 20 years, struggled to breach the fortress of guilt and regret that had become his employer's second skin. Sunday mornings found Silas in the same pew he had occupied since Margaret was small, 4th row from the front on the right side. He listened to sermons about forgiveness and redemption with the detached attention of a man who had concluded that some mistakes were too vast for earthly forgiveness. The music washed over him, the prayers felt hollow, and communion was a ritual he performed out of habit rather than faith. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had spent his life accumulating more than he could ever use had somehow ended up with so little that mattered. The ranch would pass to distant cousins when he died, people who would likely sell it to developers or corporate interests. The businesses would survive under new ownership, but the Merrick name, once spoken with respect in Marrow Creek, would fade from memory within a generation. There were mornings when Silas stood on his porch and wondered what it would feel like to simply walk away from it all, to saddle a horse and ride into the mountains until the weight of his accumulated regrets grew too heavy to carry further. But even that seemed like a luxury he didn't deserve, an escape from consequences that should be endured rather than evaded. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his brooding. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell was riding up the lane, her black medical bag secured behind her saddle. She was one of only 3 female physicians in the territory, a woman who had earned her place through competence and sheer determination. Silas respected her, though he couldn't imagine what brought her to his ranch on a Tuesday morning. "Mr. Merrick," she called out as she dismounted, securing her horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. "I apologize for the early visit, but I wanted to speak with you about something that might interest you." Dr. Hartwell was in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had delivered Margaret 23 years ago, had tended to the ranch hand's injuries and illnesses, and had been one of the few people brave enough to check on Silas during the darkest months after his daughter's death. "What can I do for you, Doctor?" She climbed the porch steps, accepting his gesture toward one of the wooden chairs. "I've been asked to serve on a committee that's organizing a school for freedmen and their children. The territorial government is finally providing some funding, but we need local support, both financial and practical." Silas felt something tighten in his chest. Margaret would have been the first to volunteer for such a project. She had always possessed a passion for education, for helping those who had been denied opportunities through no fault of their own. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of work, Doctor. Perhaps not directly," she agreed. "But your support would carry weight with other potential donors. And frankly, the project needs someone with your business acumen to help with the practical aspects, finding suitable land, organizing construction, ensuring the school has a sustainable future." The pocket watch pressed against his chest, its steady ticking a reminder of time passing, of opportunities missed and chances never taken. Margaret had once told him that a man's true wealth wasn't measured in cattle or land, but in the positive difference he made in other people's lives. At the time, he had dismissed it as naive idealism. Now it felt like wisdom he had been too stubborn to embrace. "I'll consider it," he said finally, and Dr. Hartwell smiled, the first genuine smile he had received in months. "That's all I can ask. The committee meets Friday evenings at the church. You're welcome to attend, just to listen." As she rode away, Silas remained on the porch, watching the sun climb higher over his vast holdings. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the faintest stirring of something that might eventually grow into purpose. The feeling was fragile, tentative, like the first green shoots of grass after a hard winter. But it was there, and for now, that was enough. The girl appeared on a Wednesday morning, like something conjured from dust and desperation. Silas first noticed her from his office window, a small figure standing perfectly still beside the stable, as if uncertain whether she had the right to occupy even that small patch of earth. She clutched something against her chest, and even from a distance he could see the careful way she held herself, like someone who had learned that taking up space was a privilege not granted to everyone. Tom Henley had seen her too and was already walking in her direction, his stride cautious but not unwelcoming. The ranch attracted drifters occasionally, men looking for work, women seeking shelter, families who had lost everything to drought or bad luck. Silas had a reputation for fairness, though he was selective about who he hired and equally selective about who he helped. She was young, 18, maybe 19, with skin the color of rich coffee and hair that had been carefully braided despite the obvious signs of hard travel. Her dress was clean but worn thin in places, mended with small, neat stitches that spoke of pride maintained in the face of poverty. She wore no shoes, and her feet were cut and swollen from walking on rough ground, but it was her posture that caught Silas's attention and held it. She stood with her shoulders straight and her chin raised, meeting Tom's approach with dignity that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than circumstances. Whatever she had endured to reach his ranch, it hadn't broken the essential strength that radiated from her small frame. Silas found himself leaving his office and walking toward the stable, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. As he drew Closer, he could hear the conversation between Tom and the girl. "Been walking for 3 days, sir," she was saying, her voice soft but clear. "Heard in town that Mr. Merrick might have work for someone willing to do honest labor." "What kind of work you looking for?" Tom asked, not unkindly. "Anything, sir. I can cook, clean, tend animals. I'm strong and I learn quick. I don't eat much, and I don't cause trouble." Tom glanced toward Silas, recognizing his employer's approach. "This here's Mr. Merrick himself. You can speak with him directly." The girl turned toward Silas, and he found himself looking into eyes that held depths of experience no 18-year-old should possess. They were brown eyes, almost black, and they met his gaze without flinching. There was no pleading in them, no desperation, just a quiet dignity that reminded him painfully of Margaret. "Sir," she said, offering a small curtsy that somehow managed to be respectful without being servile, "my name is Eva Washington. I've come asking if you might have work for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Silas heard himself ask. Freedwoman, sir. I understand if you don't. Most places they don't." She paused, and for just a moment the careful composure cracked. "I'm not worth much, sir, but I work hard, and I'm grateful for whatever kindness I'm shown." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. "I'm not worth much, sir." The phrase echoed in the space between them, and suddenly he was standing in his office 5 years ago, hearing Margaret's voice. "I'm not worth much to you, am I, Papa?" The world seemed to tilt slightly, and Silas felt something crack inside. His chest, not breaking entirely, but developing a hairline fracture that let in light where there had been only darkness for so long. This girl, this Eva Washington, was someone's daughter. Someone had loved her, worried about her, maybe grieved. For her, when she set out on whatever journey had brought her to his door, "What brings you to Wyoming territory?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. Eva's grip tightened on the small item she held against her chest. A worn leather Bible, Silas realized, its binding cracked and pages yellow with age and handling. "My grandmother passed last month, sir. She was all the family I had left. The people we were staying with, they said they couldn't keep me on without her there to work. They gave me a little money and told me to head west, said there might be opportunities here for someone willing to work." "You walked from where?" "Missouri, sir. Took me near 3 weeks. 3 weeks of walking," Silas thought. Sleeping rough, eating whatever she could find or afford, facing the dangers that a young woman alone on the frontier encountered daily. And yet here she stood, still proud, still hopeful, still believing that somewhere there might be a place. "For her, can you read?" "Yes, sir, grandmother taught me. Can write some too, though my letters aren't pretty." "Cook?" "Yes, sir. Not fancy cooking, but filling meals that don't waste nothing." Tom was watching this exchange with interest. He had worked for Silas long enough to recognize when his employer was fighting some internal battle, and the tension radiating from the ranch owner was almost visible. Silas looked at Eva Washington and saw not just a young woman seeking employment, but a crossroads. He could send her on her way with a few dollars and directions to other ranches that might have work. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice. Or he could do something that would raise eyebrows in Marrow Creek and potentially complicate his life in ways he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. The decision, when it came, surprised him with its clarity. "Tom, see if Martha has a spare room in the house. Something clean and private." Martha Gonzalez was the woman who came 3 times a week to maintain the main house, a widow with grown children who lived in town. Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "Boss, Miss Washington will be staying on. We'll start her with general household work and see how things develop." He turned back to Eva, who was staring at him with something approaching amazement. "Wages of $15 a month plus room and board. Fair?" "More than fair, sir. More than generous." "Silas," he said. "My name is Silas. And don't sell yourself short, Miss Washington. Everyone is worth something in this world." The last words surprised him as much as they did Eva. Where they had come from, he couldn't say, but they felt true in a way that most things hadn't for far too long. "Thank you, Mr. Silas. I won't disappoint you." As Tom led Eva toward the house. To get her settled, Silas remained by the stable watching them go. The girl walked with the same straight-back dignity she had maintained throughout their conversation, but now there was something else in her bearing. Hope, perhaps, or simply relief at finding a place to rest. He thought about the leather Bible she carried, wondering what comfort she found in its pages. Margaret had carried a Bible too, a small white one she had received for her confirmation. She had read from it regularly until her teenage years, when faith had given way to questions that Silas had been too busy or too uncomfortable to address properly. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his reflection. Sheriff Coleman was riding up the lane with Dr. Hartwell, their expressions serious. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his stomach. The arrival of authority figures rarely brought good news. "Silas," Sheriff Coleman called out as he dismounted, "need to speak with you about something." "What's on your mind, Sheriff?" "Got word from town that you've taken on help. New help." Coleman was a careful man in his 50s, someone who had learned to navigate the complex social currents of a territory where old prejudices died hard. "Some folks are concerned." "About what exactly?" "About the wisdom of housing a young colored woman on your property. You know how people talk." "Doctor." Hartwell dismounted as well, her medical bag in hand. "I told Sheriff Coleman he was worrying over nothing, but he insisted on riding out." "Appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but my hiring decisions are my own business." "Of course they are. But you know how things are, Silas. People get ideas, start spreading talk. Could be difficult for everyone involved." Silas felt anger building in his chest, not just at the implication, but at the entire web of expectations and prejudices that made a simple act of human decency seem controversial. "Anyone who wants to discuss my business decisions can come speak with me directly." Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure you knew what you might be walking into." As the sheriff and Dr. Hartwell rode away, Silas realized that his decision to help Eva Washington had already begun to reshape his world. The comfortable isolation he had maintained for 5 years was about to be challenged, and not everyone in Marrow Creek would approve of the changes. But for the first time since Margaret's death, he found that he didn't particularly care what other people thought. The girl with the worn Bible and the quiet dignity had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that sometimes the right choice and the easy choice were very different things. The pocket watch in his vest continued its steady ticking, marking time that suddenly felt less empty, more purposeful. Margaret would have approved of Eva Washington, he thought. She would have seen the same strength and potential that had prompted his impulsive offer of employment. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become the kind of man his daughter had hoped he could be. Eva's first week at the Merrick Ranch unfolded with the careful precision of someone who understood that every action was being watched and judged. She rose before dawn each morning, her small room above the kitchen already tidied, and her few possessions, the worn Bible, a change of clothes, and a simple wooden comb, arranged with military neatness on the dresser Martha Gonzalez had helped her clean. The wooden spoon she had found in the kitchen drawer on her second day became her constant companion, worn smooth by generations of hands that had stirred meals and tended to hungry people. It felt right in her palm, substantial and purposeful, as she prepared breakfast for the ranch hands in the pre-dawn darkness. Simple fare, biscuits, gravy, bacon when it was available, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, but made with the kind of care that transformed basic ingredients into something approaching comfort. "Girl knows her way around a kitchen," Tom Henley admitted to Silas on Friday morning, accepting a second cup of Eva's coffee with something resembling reverence. "Haven't eaten this well since my mama passed." The other hands had been more cautious in their acceptance. Jake Morrison, Tom's younger cousin, watched Eva with barely concealed suspicion, as if expecting her to steal something or cause trouble simply by virtue of her presence. Domingo Herrera, the soft-spoken Mexican vaquero who had worked for Silas longer than anyone except Tom, offered Eva polite nods and careful smiles, but kept his interactions brief and formal. It was young Bobby Chen, the half-Chinese ranch hand, who had faced his own share of prejudice since joining the crew 2 years earlier, who first showed Eva genuine kindness. He helped her carry water from the well, showed her where the ranch kept its emergency medical supplies, and quietly explained the unspoken rules that governed life on the Merrick spread. "Mr. Silas, he's fair," Bobby told her one afternoon as she hung laundry on the line behind the house. "But he's been hurting since his daughter died. Don't take it personal if he seems distant sometimes." Eva had nodded, understanding more than Bobby realized. She recognized the weight of grief in Silas's posture, the way he carried himself like someone expecting disappointment. It was a familiar burden. She had seen it in her grandmother's eyes after too many losses, too many farewells to people who had mattered. The work itself was not difficult, though it was varied and demanding in ways that kept Eva constantly learning. She cooked for 8 men who worked hard and ate heartily. She maintained the main house, which was larger than anywhere she had ever lived, but somehow felt empty despite its size. She tended the kitchen garden that Martha had started, but rarely had time to maintain properly, coaxing vegetables from soil that seemed reluctant to nurture anything green. But it was the interactions with Silas that proved most challenging to navigate. He was not unkind, quite the opposite. He treated her with a formal courtesy that felt both respectful and somehow distant, as if he was afraid that getting too close might break something fragile in both of them. "The north pasture fence needs attention," he would tell her over breakfast, not because she was responsible for fence repair, but because he seemed to need someone to talk to, even if the conversation remained carefully impersonal. "Tom thinks we might get early snow this year." "Yes, sir," Eva would respond, refilling his coffee cup and wondering what he wasn't saying. She found evidence of his daughter everywhere in the house, photographs on the mantelpiece, books with Margaret Merrick written in careful script on the fly leaves, a half-finished embroidery project still sitting in a basket beside the parlor window. The girl in the photographs had possessed her father's strong jaw and steady gaze, but there was something in her expression that Silas seemed to have lost, a warmth, an openness to possibility. The first real complication arose on her 8th day, when Mrs. Dorothy Whitman arrived for one of her regular visits and found Eva in the parlor, carefully dusting Margaret's photographs. "And who might you be?" Mrs. Whitman asked, her tone carrying the kind of polite chill that Eva had learned to recognize as a warning. "Eva Washington, ma'am. I work for Mr. Silas." "I see." Mrs. Whitman's gaze took in Eva's neat appearance, the careful way she handled the photograph, the fact that she was working in the main house rather than the kitchen or outbuildings. "And what sort of work do you do for Mr. Merrick?" "Housekeeping, ma'am, cooking, general maintenance." "How interesting." The words carried a weight of judgment that made Eva's chest tighten. I wonder if Silas fully considered the implications of such an arrangement. When Silas emerged from his office to greet his visitor, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Whitman's smile was bright and sharp as a knife blade. "Silas, dear, I was just meeting your new employee. Such an unusual situation." "Eva has proven quite capable," Silas replied, his voice carefully neutral. "The household has never been better maintained, I'm sure. Though I do wonder what people might think. A young woman living in your house. People do talk, you know." Eva felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding the implication even as she struggled to process the casual cruelty of it. She excused herself quickly, retreating to the kitchen, where she could hear the murmur of continued conversation without making out the specific words. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was unusual. He typically took his meals in the dining room while she ate with the hands in the bunkhouse. "Miss Washington, I want you to know that Mrs. Whitman's concerns don't reflect my feelings about your work here. You've been everything you promised to be and more." Ava looked up from the stew she was stirring, the wooden spoon steady in her hand, despite the turmoil in her chest. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Some people in this territory have narrow ideas about how things should be. That's their limitation, not yours." She studied his face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before, a kind of weary determination, as if he was preparing for a fight. He wasn't sure he could win, but felt obligated to engage anyway. "I don't want to cause trouble for you, Mr. Silas. If my being here makes things difficult, you're staying," he said firmly. "This is your home, as long as you want it to be." The word home hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either of them was quite ready to acknowledge. For Eva, who had spent the last 3 years moving from place to place after the war ended, never quite finding somewhere she belonged, the concept felt both foreign and deeply desired. For Silas, it represented a commitment he hadn't made to another human being since Margaret's death. "Yes, sir," Eva said quietly. "Thank you." After he left, Eva continued stirring the stew, the wooden spoon moving in slow, steady circles as she processed the conversation. She thought about her grandmother's Bible upstairs, about the passages that spoke of finding refuge in unexpected places, about the way God sometimes worked through the kindness of strangers. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands finishing their evening chores, their voices carrying on the wind as they discussed tomorrow's work. It was a good sound, she decided, the sound of people who belonged somewhere, who had purpose and place. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming territory, Eva Washington allowed herself to hope that she might belong here too. The hope was fragile, tentative, but it was real. And in a life that had taught her to expect disappointment, hope felt like a luxury worth protecting. The wooden spoon continued its steady rhythm, stirring together ingredients that would nourish people who worked hard and deserved comfort at the end of long days. It was simple work, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. 2 weeks into October, Eva discovered the letter while cleaning Silas's study. It had fallen behind his desk, a piece of cream-colored paper that had somehow escaped the careful organization that characterized most of his personal space. The envelope was addressed in feminine handwriting, Papa, written in elegant script that spoke of careful education and natural grace. Eva hesitated before picking it up, understanding that some things were too private to be handled by household staff. But something about the way the letter lay there, forgotten and dusty, suggested it had been lost rather than hidden. She lifted it carefully, noting the Denver postmark and the date. Just 6 months before Margaret Merrick's death. "My dear Papa," the letter began, and Eva found herself reading, despite her better judgment, drawn by the gentle affection in the words. "David is feeling much better, and we hope to visit the ranch before the snow flies. I know you worry about our circumstances, but please understand that we are truly happy. There is more to wealth than money, more to success than accumulation. I pray that someday you will see that the love we share is worth more than all the cattle in Wyoming." Eva stopped reading, carefully refolding the letter and placing it prominently on Silas's desk where he would find it. But the words stayed with her as she went about her morning tasks, echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't quite forget. Margaret Merrick had possessed wisdom that transcended her years, an understanding of what truly mattered that her father was only now beginning to glimpse. The ranch was settling into the rhythm of approaching winter, with cattle being moved to sheltered pastures and supplies being stockpiled for the long months ahead. Eva had found her place in this rhythm, rising early to prepare hearty breakfasts that would sustain men working in increasingly cold conditions, spending her afternoons preserving vegetables from the garden and mending clothes that would need to last until spring, She had also begun venturing into town with Martha Gonzalez, helping with the weekly shopping and slowly becoming a familiar sight on Marrow Creek's main street. The reactions to her presence were varied and telling. Some shopkeepers served her with polite efficiency, treating her as they would any customer with money to spend. Others made their disapproval clear through cold stares and reluctant service. It was at Porter's general store that Eva encountered the most direct hostility. Mrs. Caroline Porter, a sharp-featured woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business, made no effort to hide her feelings about the young freedwoman who dared to shop as if she belonged in civilized society. "I suppose you're buying for the Merrick household," Mrs. Porter said, when Eva approached the counter with a list of items Martha had requested. "Yes, ma'am. Sugar, flour, coffee beans, and some fabric for mending, if you have it." "How convenient for you, finding such accommodating employment." The words dripped with implication. Eva felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Merrick has been very fair." "I'm sure he has." Mrs. Porter's smile was razor-thin. "Men can be so generous when properly motivated." The insult hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the space between them. Eva understood exactly what was being suggested, that her employment was somehow improper, that her presence in Silas's household served purposes beyond legitimate work. The accusation was both insulting and dangerous, the kind of rumor that could destroy reputations and justify violence. "Ma'am," Eva said carefully, "I work hard for my wages, same as anyone. Mr. Merrick treats me with respect because I've earned it." "Of course, dear. I'm sure that's exactly how you see it." The conversation might have escalated, but Martha Gonzalez chose that moment to enter the store, her presence immediately changing the dynamic. Martha was a respected member of the community, a woman whose late husband had been well regarded and whose own reputation was beyond reproach. "Eva, honey, you ready to head back? I've got the medicine Dr. Hartwell ordered for Tom's arthritis." "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Porter was just filling our order." Martha's dark eyes took in the tension between Eva and the shopkeeper, and her expression hardened slightly. "Caroline, I hope you're taking good care of our Eva here. She's been a blessing to the Merrick household and to those of us who care about Silas's well-being." The words carried weight, a subtle reminder that Eva enjoyed the protection of respected community members. Mrs. Porter's manner became noticeably more professional as she completed the transaction, though the hostile undercurrent remained. On the ride back to the ranch, Martha addressed the incident directly. "Don't let Caroline Porter or people like her make you question your worth, Mija. She's unhappy with her own life and looking for someone to blame. It's not just her, though. I see it in their faces when we come to town, like I'm something that doesn't belong." Martha was quiet for a moment, guiding the wagon around a pothole in the dusty road. "You know what I think? I think you remind them of changes they're not ready to accept. The war ended, slavery ended, but some folks want everything else to stay the same. They want the world to be simple, with everyone in their place and no questions asked." "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here." "Child, belonging isn't about what other people think. It's about finding a place where you can grow, where you can be useful, where you can make a difference. You've done all three at the Merrick ranch." That evening, Eva found Silas sitting on the front porch, despite the October chill, the letter she had discovered lying open in his lap. He looked up as she approached with a cup of hot coffee, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Spilling from the house. "Thank you," he said, accepting the coffee. "And thank you for finding this. I thought it was lost forever." "It's a beautiful letter. She sounds like she was a wonderful person." Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that rose like dark shadows against the star-filled sky. She was too good for this world, her mother used to say. Too trusting, too generous, too willing to see the best in people. Those sound like fine qualities to me. They are, but they can make life difficult when the world doesn't live up to your expectations. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Margaret believed that people were fundamentally good, that understanding and kindness could overcome any obstacle. I used to think that was naive. And now? Now I think maybe she was the smart one, and I was the fool. Eva settled into the chair beside him, wrapping her shawl more tightly against the cool air. My grandmother used to say that the heart sees truth, the mind can't understand. Maybe your daughter saw something the rest of us are still learning. What did your grandmother think about forgiveness? The question surprised Eva with its directness, and she considered it carefully before answering. She said forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was about laying down the burden of anger so you could pick up the burden of love instead. Wise woman she was. Lost 3 sons in the war, 2 grandsons to fever, saw her husband sold away when she was young, but she never let bitterness take root in her heart. Said it would poison everything good that tried to grow. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 people who had known loss, sharing the quiet peace of evening on the frontier. Finally Silas spoke again. I hear there was some unpleasantness in town today. Eva wasn't surprised that word had reached him. In a community the size of Marrow Creek, gossip traveled faster than horses. Nothing I can't handle. That's not the point. You shouldn't have to handle it. People are going to think what they want to think. I can't control that. No, but I can control how I respond to it. He stood, finishing the last of his coffee. Tomorrow, I'm riding into town to make something's clear. It's past time certain people understood that you're under my protection, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Eva felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not just gratitude, but a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt since her grandmother's death. Thank you, Mr. Silas. That means more than you know. Silas, he corrected gently. Just Silas. We're family here, Eva. All of us. As he headed inside, Eva remained on the porch, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. Family. It was a word she had almost forgotten how to hope for. The quilting frame arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by Bobby Chen and Jake Morrison, with grins that suggested they were privy to something Eva didn't yet understand. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, made from polished oak with brass fittings that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Where did this come from? Eva asked, running her hands over the smooth wood with something approaching reverence. Boss ordered it from Denver, Bobby explained. Said something about the house needing more warmth for winter. Eva found Silas in his study, reviewing ledgers with the focused attention of a man who had built his fortune on careful attention to detail. He looked up as she knocked on the doorframe, and she thought she detected a hint of anticipation in his expression. The quilting frame is beautiful, thank you. Margaret used to quilt, he said simply. Her frame was damaged in a storm last year, and I never got around to replacing it. Seemed like it was time. There was more to it than that, Eva suspected. In the 3 weeks since his confrontation with Mrs. Porter and several other prominent townspeople, Silas had been making subtle but unmistakable statements about Ava's place in his household. The quilting frame was another such statement, an expensive, permanent addition that suggested her residence was neither temporary nor questionable. His trip to town had been effective, if not entirely welcome. Mrs. Porter now served Eva with a grudging courtesy, and most other merchants had followed suit. But the cost of that protection was becoming apparent in the careful distance some people now maintained from Silas himself. Old friendships had cooled, invitations had stopped coming, and even church attendance had become an exercise in polite isolation. People are treating you differently because of me, Eva had observed the previous Sunday, watching the way conversations paused when Silas entered the church. People are revealing who they truly are, he had replied. I'm grateful for the clarification. Now setting up the quilting frame in the front parlor, where the light was best, Eva understood that this was another step in that process of clarification. A quilting frame was not something a man purchased for temporary help. It was an investment, Impermanence, a signal that Eva Washington was not just passing through the Merrick household. The frame itself was more than functional. It was an invitation to create something beautiful and lasting. Eva had learned quilting from her grandmother, sitting beside the older woman's frame during long winter evenings, listening to stories about ancestors who had stitched together scraps of fabric and hope in equal measure. A quilt tells the story of the woman who makes it, her grandmother had taught her. Every piece has a history, every stitch carries intention. When you look at a quilt, you're looking at somebody's life. Dr. Hartwell visited that afternoon, ostensibly to check on Tom Henley's arthritis, but clearly interested in discussing the freedman school project that had been occupying her thoughts. She found Eva setting up the quilting frame and paused to admire the craftsmanship. "This is lovely. Are you planning a winter project? I thought I might start something. It's been a while since I had the opportunity. What pattern?" Eva smiled, running her fingers along the frame's edge. "I was thinking about a wedding ring pattern, but using different colors, blues and greens instead of traditional reds and whites, like the mountains and sky." "How fitting." Dr. Hartwell studied Eva with the assessing gaze that had made her an effective physician. "I wonder if I might ask a favor. The school committee is meeting tomorrow evening, and we could use someone with your practical skills to help with planning. Would you consider joining us?" The invitation surprised Eva, though she tried not to show it. Community involvement of this sort was not typically extended to people in her position, regardless of their capabilities. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Mom." "Why not? You can read and write, you understand what children need, and you have experience managing resources efficiently. Those are exactly the skills we need." Silas appeared in the doorway at that moment, drawn by the sound of conversation. "What skills are we discussing?" Dr. Hartwell explained about the school committee and her invitation to Eva. Silas listened without comment. But Eva could see him processing the implications, the further integration into community life, the additional opportunities for controversy, the continuing evolution of Eva's role from employee to something approaching equal. "The decision is Eva's to make," he said finally. "But I think the committee would benefit from her perspective." That evening, as Eva prepared dinner, she found herself thinking about the quilting frame waiting in the parlor and the invitation to join the school committee. Both represented opportunities she hadn't dared hope for when she'd arrived at the ranch 6 weeks earlier. Both also represented risks, the possibility of disappointment, rejection, failure. "You're thinking awful hard about something," Martha Gonzalez observed, arriving for her evening visit with fresh bread from town. "Dr. Hartwell asked me to join the school committee." "That's wonderful. You should do it." "Should I? People are already talking about my being here. Getting more involved might make things worse for everyone." Martha settled into a chair at the kitchen table, accepting a cup of coffee with the comfortable ease of someone who had become a trusted friend. "Mia, let me tell you something about this territory. It's full of people who came here to start over, to be something different than what they were back east. Some of them embrace that opportunity, and some of them try to recreate the exact same problems they left behind." "Which kind am I dealing with?" "Both kinds, but the first kind is stronger, even if they're quieter about it. They're the ones building something better, not just something familiar." The next evening, Eva found herself walking into the Marrow, Greek Methodist church, with her worn Bible under her arm, and her heart beating faster than the occasion warranted. The committee meeting was small. Dr. Hartwell, Reverend Morrison, 2 other women Eva didn't know well, and surprisingly Tom Henley, who had apparently been recruited for his construction expertise. "Eva, thank you for coming," Dr. Hartwell said warmly. "Let me introduce you to Mrs. Sarah Chen, Bobby's mother, and Mrs. Ruth Anderson, whose husband owns the lumber mill." The introductions were polite but careful, and Eva sensed that her presence had been discussed before her arrival. She took a seat near the back, close enough to participate, but positioned to leave quickly if the situation became uncomfortable. We're discussing curriculum, Reverend Morrison explained. Basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, of course, but we want to include practical skills as well. Farming, household management, perhaps some trade skills for the older students. What? About history? Eva asked, then immediately wondered if she had overstepped. What kind of history? Mrs. Chen inquired, genuinely curious. The children should know their own history, where they came from, what their families endured, what they've overcome, but also the history of this territory, how it's changing, their place in that change. Mrs. Anderson leaned forward. That's an interesting perspective. Most schools focus on ancient history, European history. That's important too, Eva agreed. But these children need to understand that they're part of something larger, something still being written. They need to know they have the power to shape their own stories. The discussion that followed was animated and productive, and Eva found herself contributing ideas about curriculum, resource management, and the practical challenges of teaching children from diverse backgrounds. When the meeting ended 2 hours later, she realized that she had not only participated, but had helped shape the direction of the project. That was excellent, Dr. Hartwell told her as they walked toward the church door. I hope you'll consider joining us permanently. Outside, Silas was waiting with the wagon, reading a book by lamplight. He looked up as she approached, and she thought she saw pride in his expression. How did it go? Better than I expected. They want me to help develop the curriculum. Of course they do. You have good ideas and the courage to share them. On the ride home, Eva reflected on the evening's events. The quilting frame waited for her in the parlor, ready to help her create something beautiful from disparate pieces. The school committee offered a chance to help build something important for the future. Both opportunities required faith in herself, in the community, in the possibility that acceptance could be earned rather than simply granted. Silas, she said as they neared the ranch, thank you for the quilting frame, for encouraging me to join the committee, for believing I could contribute something worthwhile. Eva, he replied quietly, you've contributed more to this household than you know, more than I knew how to ask for. The words carried weight that surprised them both, an acknowledgement of how much their arrangement had evolved from employer and employee to something deeper and more complex. As they reached the house, Eva felt the same sense of pieces coming together that she experienced when quilting, different elements combining to create something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could be alone. December brought snow to the high country, transforming the Merrick Ranch into a landscape of pristine white that seemed to muffle not just sound, but conflict as well. The rhythm of ranch life slowed during the winter months, with cattle moved to sheltered valleys, and most outdoor work reduced to essential maintenance and feeding. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Silas entered the parlor where Eva was working on her quilt, the blue and green pieces slowly forming the intricate pattern she had envisioned. He carried something in his hand, a silver-framed photograph that Eva recognized as one of several that usually resided on his private study desk. I thought you might like to see this, he said, settling into the chair across from her quilting frame. It's Margaret at 18, about your age. Eva set down her needle and accepted the photograph carefully. The young woman looking back at her had indeed inherited her father's strong features, but they were softened by an expression of gentle intelligence and unmistakable warmth. Margaret Merrick had possessed the kind of beauty that came from within. Not just physical attractiveness, but a luminous quality that spoke of kindness and genuine interest in the world around her. She's lovely, Eva said softly. You can see the goodness in her eyes. She was always bringing home strays, Silas continued, his voice carrying the fond exasperation of a parent recalling a child's persistent habits. Injured birds, orphaned, kittens, children who were being bullied at school. Our house was constantly full of Margaret's rescue projects. What happened to her? Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the hearth. Fever took her in Denver. She and David were helping with an outbreak in the immigrant quarter, families who couldn't afford proper medical care. Margaret organized food deliveries, medicine, whatever was needed. She caught the fever herself and was too weak to fight it off. She died helping others. Just like her to do that, always putting everyone else's needs ahead of her own safety. There was no bitterness in his voice, only the deep sadness of a parent who had learned too late to appreciate what he had lost. I was angry with her for years, for marrying David, for leaving the ranch, for choosing a life I couldn't understand. I thought she was wasting her potential, throwing away everything I had built for her. Eva continued stitching, her hands working steadily while she listened. She had learned that Silas often found it easier to talk while she was occupied with other tasks, as if the domestic normalcy made difficult conversations feel safer. But you understand now? Now I understand that she was the wisest person I ever knew. She saw what really mattered while I was busy accumulating things that didn't matter at all. Eva held up the photograph again, studying Margaret's face with new understanding. I think she would be proud of what you're doing now. The school committee, helping people in the community, giving me a chance when no one else would. You think so? I know so. People don't change overnight, but they can change. She would see that in you. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching through the snow. Tom Henley appeared at the front door minutes later, stamping snow from his boots and carrying news from town. Boss, we got trouble brewing. Word came from the territorial capital that some federal inspectors are heading this way, asking questions about labor practices on the big ranches. Silas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. What kind of questions? The kind that make nervous white folks start looking for scapegoats. Sheriff Coleman thinks some people might try to cause problems for Eva, make it look like you're violating some law about colored folks and white households. Eva felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the December weather. She had been too comfortable, too confident that acceptance was simply a matter of proving her worth through hard work and good character. But she was learning that some people would always see her presence as a threat to an order they were determined to preserve. What does the sheriff recommend? Silas asked. That Eva stays close to the ranch until the inspectors finish their business. Maybe visits her aunt in Kansas for a few weeks. I don't have an aunt in Kansas, Eva said quietly. I know that, and you know that, but other folks don't need to know that. Silas stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could look out at the snow-covered landscape. I'm not sending Eva away because some people are uncomfortable with progress. She's done nothing wrong, and neither have I. Boss, I understand how you feel, but sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. This could get ugly fast. Eva folded the photograph carefully and handed it back to Silas. Maybe Tom's right. If my being here causes problems for you, for the ranch, no. Silas's voice carried the authority that had built his empire and commanded respect throughout the territory. This is your home, Eva. You don't run from home because visitors might not approve of the furniture. Tom Henley exchanged a look with Eva, both of them recognizing the stubborn streak that had made Silas successful, but sometimes made him inflexible when flexibility might be wiser. I appreciate your loyalty, Eva said carefully, but I also understand the position this puts you in. Maybe there's a middle ground. What do you have in mind? I could stay with Martha for a few days, help her with some projects she's been putting off. It wouldn't look like running away, just like lending a hand to a friend. Silas considered. This, clearly unhappy with any solution that involved Eva leaving the ranch, but perhaps recognizing the wisdom of avoiding unnecessary confrontation. How long would these inspectors likely stay? Week, maybe 2. Tom replied. Depends on what they find and how cooperative folks are. The next morning, Eva packed her few belongings with the same careful efficiency she had brought to everything else. The quilting frame would wait for her return, the partially completed pattern, a promise that this departure was temporary. But as she folded her grandmother's Bible into her small traveling bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was about to change. Silas accompanied her to town, riding alongside Martha's wagon in a display of protection that was both touching and potentially problematic. His presence made it clear that Eva was under his care, but it also reinforced exactly the kind of speculation that had prompted this precautionary move. "You'll send word if you need anything," he said as they reached Martha's small house on the edge of town. "I'll be fine. Martha will take good care of me." "I know she will, but you'll send word anyway." Eva smiled, recognizing the parental concern in his voice. "Yes, Silas, I'll send word." As the wagon pulled away from the ranch, Eva looked back at the house where she had found not just employment, but something approaching family. The mountains rose behind it like protective guardians, and smoke from the kitchen chimney promised warmth and comfort for whoever was lucky enough to call the place home. She pressed Margaret's photograph against her chest, a connection to the young woman who had understood that true wealth lay in relationships rather than possessions. In a few days, she would return to the ranch and resume her life there, but she was beginning to understand that some battles couldn't be avoided forever, and that the cost of belonging might be higher than either she or Silas had anticipated. The snow continued falling as they reached town, covering everything in pristine white that would soon be marked by the footprints of those who had business to conduct. Regardless of the weather or the obstacles in their path, the federal inspectors arrived on a Thursday morning, when the snow had temporarily stopped, but the world remained locked in winter's grip. Eva watched from Martha's kitchen window as the two men rode down Main Street, their official bearing unmistakable even from a distance. They were younger than she had expected, probably government men from back east who had drawn the short straw for frontier assignments. They looked serious, Martha observed, joining Eva at the window. "They're here about labor practices," Tom said, "making sure the big ranchers aren't taking advantage of colored workers." But within hours, it became clear that the inspection was about more than labor practices. Word traveled quickly through Marrow Creek's small business district. The investigators were asking specific questions about property ownership, land purchases dating back 15 years, and particularly about transactions involving the Merrick Ranch. Dr. Hartwell arrived at Martha's house that afternoon with news that made Eva's chest tighten with apprehension. "They're not just labor inspectors," she announced without preamble. "They're from the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. They're investigating claims that some territorial land sales violated federal laws about property seized from Confederate sympathizers." "What does that have to do with Mr. Silas?" Eva asked, though something cold was already settling in her stomach. "I'm not sure yet, but they're asking specific questions about a plantation in Missouri that was seized in 1863. The Washington plantation." Eva felt the world tilt slightly. "Washington Plantation. You know the name?" Eva's mouth had gone dry. "That was my family's name, my grandmother's family. They worked for the Washington family before the war." Dr. Hartwell studied Eva's face with the careful attention that had made her an effective physician. "Eva, what exactly did your grandmother tell you about your family's history?" "That we worked for a family named Washington in Missouri. Good people," she said, "who treated their workers fairly even before the war ended. When the Union Army came through, the family lost everything and scattered. Grandmother said the old master helped as many folks as he could get to safety before the soldiers came." "Did she ever mention the land itself? What happened to it?" "She said it was sold to pay debts, that the family lost everything because they wouldn't fight for the Confederacy." Dr. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, processing information that Eva sensed was significant in ways she didn't yet understand. "Eva, I think you need to hear this directly from the investigators, and I think Silas needs to be there when you do." An hour later, Eva found herself sitting in Sheriff Coleman's office across from two federal agents whose expressions suggested they were about to deliver news that would change everything. Silas had arrived within minutes of being summoned, his face grim with the knowledge that whatever was coming would not be simple or painless. Agent Harrison, the older of the two investigators, opened a leather portfolio and removed several documents that he arranged carefully on the desk between them. "Miss Washington, we understand that your grandmother, Charity Washington, worked for the Washington family plantation in Buchanan County, Missouri, before and during the war." "Yes, sir. That's what she told me. According to our records, the Washington plantation was seized by Union forces in 1863 on suspicion of Confederate sympathy. The land was subsequently sold at auction to settle debts and as punishment for alleged treason." Eva nodded, unsure where this was leading, but feeling increasingly uneasy. The buyer of that land was a young cattle rancher from Wyoming Territory named Silas Merrick. The words seemed to echo in the small office, and Eva felt as if the floor had suddenly become unstable beneath her chair. She turned to look at Silas, whose face had gone pale and whose hands were gripping his hat with white knuckles. "That's not possible," Eva said quietly. Agent Harrison consulted his documents. "Mr. Merrick purchased 3,200 acres of the former Washington plantation for $2,400, well below market value even for wartime sales. He then resold the land to a development company 6 months later for $8,900, using the profit to purchase additional ranch land in Wyoming." Eva felt something break inside her chest, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "Silas?" "Eva, I can explain. Mr. Merrick," Agent Harrison continued relentlessly, "our investigation suggests that you may have knowingly purchased property that was improperly seized from civilians who were not, in fact, Confederate sympathizers. The Washington family has been cleared of any treasonous activity, and their descendants may be entitled to compensation. But they're all dead," Eva whispered. "Grandmother said the old master and his family all died during the war." "Not all of them," Agent Harrison said gently. "Charles Washington, the plantation owner's youngest son, survived the war and has been searching for information about his family's former workers. He wants to provide compensation to those who lost their livelihoods when the property was seized." The second agent, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "Miss Washington, Charles Washington is specifically looking for information about a woman named Charity and her family. He believes they may be entitled to a portion of any compensation recovered from the improper sale." Eva's mind raced, trying to process information that seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about her past and her present. "How much compensation?" "Potentially significant. The land Mr. Merrick purchased is now worth approximately $30,000. If the sale is ruled improper, he could be liable for the difference between what he paid and fair market value, plus interest, over the intervening years." Silas finally found his voice. "The purchase was legal at the time. I had no way of knowing." "That may be true," Agent Harrison acknowledged, "but ignorance doesn't absolve you of responsibility for profiting from an injustice, even an unintentional one." Eva stood abruptly, needing space to think, to breathe, to understand what this meant for everything she had come to believe about her life at the Merrick Ranch. The man who had offered her employment, who had protected her from the town's prejudice, who had become like family to her, had built part of his fortune on the destruction of her family's previous life. "I need some air," she managed to say. Outside the sheriff's office, Eva walked aimlessly through the snow-covered streets of Marrow Creek, her mind struggling to reconcile the Silas she had come to know with the young man who had profited from her family's misfortune. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The man who had offered her worth and belonging had unknowingly participated in the system that had declared her family worthless in the first place. When Silas found her an hour later sitting on the steps of the church where she had joined the school committee, his face carried the weight of someone who had been forced to confront his own past in the harshest possible light. "Eva, please let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you bought my family's home for nothing and sold it for a fortune." That your wealth was built on our loss? I was 25 years old, Eva. I had saved every penny for 2 years to buy that land. I thought I was making a legitimate business, investment, and when you found out the truth—" Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't find out the truth until today, but I should have asked more questions at the time. I should have wondered why the price was so low, why the sale was so urgent. I was too focused on the opportunity to consider the cost to others." Eva looked at him, seeing not the confident rancher she had come to respect, but a young man who had made choices based on ambition rather than conscience. "What happens now? I don't know. But I want you to know that whatever compensation you're entitled to, you'll receive every penny. And if that means selling the ranch to make it right, then that's what I'll do. You'd lose everything. I've already lost everything that matters once before. I won't let that happen again." The snow began falling again as they sat on the church steps. Two people whose lives had been irrevocably connected by history and circumstance, grappling with the realization that the past was never as simple or as distant as they had believed. The documents in Agent Harrison's portfolio had rewritten not just their individual stories, but the story of their relationship, transforming an act of charity into an act of restitution and raising questions about justice, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption across generations. In her pocket, Eva's fingers found her grandmother's Bible, the worn leather a reminder of faith that persisted even when the world revealed its capacity for both cruelty and unexpected grace. Whatever came next, she realized, would test not just their ability to navigate legal complexities, but their capacity to find truth and healing in the midst of painful revelations about the past. The legal documents spread across Martha's kitchen table, like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture no one wanted to see clearly. Eva sat studying the papers by lamplight, while Martha prepared coffee with the determined efficiency of someone who had learned that life's most difficult moments were best faced with practical comforts close at hand. "Listen to this," Eva said, reading from a letter written in careful script. "Charles Washington writes, 'I have spent 20 years searching for the people who worked our land, not because the law requires it, but because my father made me promise on his deathbed that I would find them and make things right. Charity Washington was like family to us. If she had descendants, they deserved to know their history and receive what was rightfully theirs." Martha set down a steaming cup beside Eva's elbow. "Sounds like a man carrying his own burden of guilt. But why should he feel guilty? His family lost everything too. Sometimes guilt isn't about what you did wrong. Sometimes it's about what you couldn't prevent." Dr. Hartwell arrived as the clock struck 9, bringing news from the territorial capital, where she had spent the day consulting with legal experts about the implications of the federal investigation. "The situation is complicated," she announced, settling into a chair with the weary demeanor of someone who had spent hours navigating bureaucratic complexities. "The original land seizure has been ruled improper, which means Charles Washington is entitled to compensation. But that doesn't automatically make Silas liable for the full amount." "What does it make him liable for?" Eva asked. "The difference between what he paid and what the land was actually worth at the time, plus reasonable interest. That comes to approximately $8,000. Substantial, but not financially devastating." Eva felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "So he wouldn't have to sell the ranch?" "Not necessarily. But there's another complication. Charles Washington isn't just seeking monetary compensation. He wants to establish a trust fund for the descendants of his family's former workers. He's asking Silas to contribute not just the legal settlement, but additional funds to create something lasting." "How much additional?" "Enough to properly endow the freedmen's school we've been planning, plus funds for individual families who can prove they worked the Washington plantation. We're talking about $25,000 total." The figure hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Ava understood enough about ranch economics to know that such a sum would require Silas to sell significant assets, possibly including portions of the land that had been in his family for 30 years. Has anyone told him about this? I'm going to ride out to the ranch tomorrow morning. I wanted to discuss it with you first. Eva stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered town where she had begun to build a new life. The church, where she had joined the school committee, stood dark against the winter sky, a reminder of the future they had been planning before the past had arrived to complicate everything. What does Charles Washington want from me specifically? He wants to meet you, to hear what your grandmother told you about the family, to understand what happened to the other workers after the seizure, and he wants to offer you a choice. What kind of choice? Dr. Hartwell consulted her notes. You could accept a cash settlement. Your share would be approximately $3,000, enough to buy property, start a business, live independently anywhere you choose. Or you could become part of the trust he's establishing, help oversee the school and the assistance program for other families, and leave the ranch. Not necessarily. The trust could be administered from Marrow Creek, if that's what you prefer, but it would mean taking on significant responsibilities, becoming a public figure in ways that might be uncomfortable. Eva returned to the table, touching the legal documents with the same careful attention she had once given to her grandmother's Bible. The papers represented justice, opportunity, independence, everything she had never dared to hope for when she'd arrived at Silas's ranch looking for honest work. They also represented a choice between the life she had begun to build and the life her family's history entitled her to claim. There's something else, Dr. Hartwell continued gently. Charles Washington has been in contact with several other families who worked his father's plantation. They're organizing a reunion of sorts, a gathering to share memories and plan for the future. He's invited you to attend. Where? Kansas City. Next month. Eva closed her eyes, imagining herself in a room full of strangers who shared her history. People who had known her grandmother as a young woman, who could tell her stories about a past she had only glimpsed through Charity's careful recollections. I need to talk to Silas, she said finally. Of course. But Eva, before you do, consider this. Whatever you decide about the settlement, you've already changed things here. The school committee wants you to stay regardless of what happens with the legal situation. You've proven yourself as a teacher, an organizer, a leader. That doesn't disappear just because your circumstances change. The next morning, Eva rode out to the ranch with Dr. Hartwell, the legal documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into her saddlebags. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, as if the revelation about its history had altered not just her understanding, but the very appearance of the land itself. She found Silas in the barn, methodically repairing harnesses with the focused attention of someone who needed to keep his hands busy while his mind processed difficult truths. He looked up as she entered, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of hope and apprehension that she felt in her own chest. Eva, I wasn't sure you'd come back. This is still my home, she said simply, at least for now. Dr. Hartwell explained the legal situation while Eva watched Silas's face, seeing him calculate not just the financial implications, but the moral ones. When the doctor finished, he was quiet for a long moment, testing the strength of the leather he had been mending. $25,000, he said finally. That would require selling the north pasture, probably some of the cattle as well. You don't have to agree to anything beyond the legal settlement, Dr. Hartwell pointed out. The additional contribution is voluntary. Is it, though? Silas looked directly at Eva. If I profit from an injustice, even unknowingly, don't I have a responsibility to address that injustice as completely as possible? Eva felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride mixed with affection for this man who continued to surprise her with his capacity for moral courage. What would Margaret think? Margaret would tell me to do what's right, regardless of the cost. He set down the harness and stood, brushing dust from his hands. She'd probably also point out that money is just a tool, and tools are only valuable if you use them for something worthwhile. So you'll agree to the full settlement. I'll agree to whatever makes things right. But I have one condition. What's that? I want to meet Charles Washington myself. I want to understand what kind of man he is, what his intentions are for the future. If I'm going to trust him with this much money and this much responsibility, I need to look him in the eye. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. That can be arranged. He's planning to come to Wyoming Territory next month to meet with Eva and finalize the arrangements. And Eva, Silas continued, I want you to know that whatever you decide about your future, you'll always have a place here. The ranch, the community we've built. None of that changes just because your circumstances do. Eva felt tears prick her eyes, understanding that Silas was offering her something more valuable than money. The security of knowing she belonged somewhere, regardless of what choices she made about her inheritance. Thank you, she said quietly. That means everything to me. That evening, as Eva prepared dinner in the ranch kitchen while snow fell steadily outside, she reflected on the weight of the decisions facing her. The quilting frame still stood in the parlor, her partially completed pattern waiting for her return. But now she understood that the quilt might represent something different than she had originally intended. Not just the piecing together of beautiful scraps, but the complex process of creating something whole from elements that carried their own difficult histories. The legal documents upstairs represented justice delayed but not denied, opportunity earned through suffering, the possibility of healing wounds that had festered for decades. But they also represented the end of the simple certainty she had found at the Merrick Ranch, the beginning of responsibilities and choices she had never anticipated. As she stirred the evening stew, Eva thought about her grandmother's words about forgiveness being the act of laying down the burden of anger to pick up the burden of love instead. Soon she would need to decide what burdens she was prepared to carry, and what kind of love she was ready to embrace for her own future, for the community that had become her home, and for the man who had offered her worth when she believed. She had none to claim. Charles Washington arrived in Marrow Creek on a Tuesday in February when the snow had begun to melt and the promise of spring seemed almost believable. He was younger than Eva had expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of careful posture that suggested he had learned to carry himself with dignity despite losses that might have broken a lesser man. The meeting was arranged in the parlor of the Marrow Creek Hotel, the only space in town, large enough to accommodate the participants and formal enough to suit the gravity of the occasion. Eva sat beside Silas, acutely aware of the contract that lay on the table between them, pages of careful legal language that would transform her life regardless of how she chose to sign them. "Miss Washington," Charles said, rising as she entered the room, "I can see charity in your eyes. She was one of the finest people I ever knew." The words hit Eva unexpectedly, carrying with them the weight of recognition from someone who had known her grandmother as a young woman, who could testify to her character from personal experience rather than stories passed down through generations. "She spoke of your family often," Eva replied. "She said you were good people, that your father tried to protect everyone when the soldiers came. He tried, but he was one man against a war that had already decided our fate." Charles settled back into his chair, his hands folded carefully in his lap. "I've spent 20 years learning that good intentions aren't enough if you don't have the power to act on them." Silas leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Washington, I want you to know that I had no idea about the circumstances of the land sale when I made the purchase. If I had, you were 25 years old, Mr. Merrick. I was 20 when our plantation was seized. We both made decisions based on the information we had and the opportunities we saw. The question now is what we do with the wisdom age has given us." Dr. Hartwell, serving as an unofficial mediator, consulted her notes. "Mr. Washington, perhaps you could explain your vision for the trust fund and how you see it operating." Charles nodded, his expression becoming more animated as he discussed plans that clearly represented years of careful thought. The Freedmen's School here in Marrow Creek would be just the beginning. I envision a network of schools across the territory, each one serving as both an educational institution and a community center. But more than that, I want to create opportunities for economic independence, loans for starting businesses, assistance with purchasing land, support for families who want to build something lasting. And the administrative structure? Silas asked. That's where Miss Washington comes in, if she's willing. Charles turned to Eva with an expression of gentle hopefulness. I need someone who understands both the challenges our people face and the opportunities this territory offers. Someone who can work with local communities, who can bridge the gap between what is and what could be. Eva felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a heavy coat. It's a tremendous responsibility. It is. But you've already proven you can handle tremendous responsibility. Dr. Hartwell tells me you've helped design a curriculum that could serve as a model for other schools. Mr. Merrick tells me you've managed his household with efficiency and grace. The school committee here speaks of you as an essential member who brings both practical skills and visionary thinking. The position would require travel, Dr. Hartwell added. You'd need to visit communities throughout the territory, assess needs, oversee implementation of programs. It wouldn't be a quiet life. Eva looked around the room at the faces of people who had become important to her. Charles Washington, who represented her family's past and her people's future. Dr. Hartwell, who had opened doors she hadn't even known existed, and Silas, who had given her the chance to discover her own worth. What about the ranch? She asked Silas directly. What about the life we've built there? The life we've built. There will always be part of who you are, Silas replied carefully, but it doesn't have to define the limits of who you might become. Charles Washington reached into his satchel and withdrew another document, not a legal contract, but a letter written on familiar stationery. This came from a woman named Sarah Chen, who I believe you know. She's writing on behalf of the school committee here in Marrow Creek. Eva accepted the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Mrs. Chen's careful script detailed a proposal that made her heart race with possibility. The school committee wanted to offer her a permanent position as head administrator for the new Freedmen's School, with the understanding that she would also serve as regional coordinator for Charles Washington's Educational Trust. They want me to do both jobs. They want you to create a model that other communities can follow, Charles explained. A school that serves its local population while also serving as a training center for teachers and administrators who can start similar programs elsewhere. Silas was reading over her shoulder, and she could feel his growing excitement. Eva, this would keep you in Marrow Creek while still allowing you to impact the entire territory. You could maintain your connections here while building something much larger. But the travel requirements could be managed through careful scheduling and the eventual training of assistants, Dr. Hartwell suggested. As the network grows, you'd be able to delegate more of the day-to-day operations. Eva set down the letter and looked directly at Charles Washington. Why me? There must be other people with more experience, more education. There are people with more formal education, he acknowledged, but education without wisdom is just information. You've demonstrated the ability to see what's possible while understanding what's practical. You've earned respect in a community that didn't initially welcome you. Most importantly, you understand that true change happens one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time. The contract on the table seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light streaming through the hotel's tall windows. Eva understood that signing it would change everything: her financial circumstances, her social position, her daily responsibilities, her future possibilities. It would also mean accepting a burden of leadership that would affect hundreds, potentially thousands of lives. I need to understand one thing, she said finally. This isn't charity, is it? This isn't about making reparations for past wrongs. No. Charles said firmly. "This is about investing in the future. I've watched you work with the school committee, seen the curriculum you've helped develop, observed how you've handled the complexities of your situation here. This offer is based on your demonstrated abilities, not your family history." Silas reached across the table and placed his hand over Eva's. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. Margaret would be proud of you too." Eva looked down at their joined hands, his weathered and scarred from decades of hard work, hers smooth but strong from her own labor. It struck her that this moment represented everything her grandmother had hoped for when she'd taught Eva to read and write, when she'd insisted that education was the one thing no one could take away. "I need one night to think about it," Eva said finally. "Of course," Charles replied, "but I hope you'll remember that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that scare us the most." As the meeting broke up and the participants prepared to leave, Eva felt the weight of possibility settling into her bones. The contract represented not just an opportunity, but a chance to honor her grandmother's memory while building something that could outlast them all. That evening, Eva sat alone in the ranch house parlor, her grandmother's worn Bible open in her lap, while the quilting frame cast long shadows in the lamplight. The contract lay on the table beside her, its formal language representing a future she had never dared to imagine when she'd first stood outside Silas's stable asking for work. She had sent Silas to the bunkhouse to discuss the day's events with Tom and the other hands, needing space to think without the weight of anyone else's hopes or expectations. But now, in the quiet of the house where she had found both employment and something approaching family, the magnitude of the decision before her felt almost overwhelming. The Bible fell open to a passage her grandmother had marked with a faded ribbon, Jeremiah 29:11, words about plans for hope and a future that Charity Washington had clung to through decades of uncertainty. Eva traced the familiar verse with her finger, remembering the countless evenings when her grandmother had read these words aloud, always emphasizing the word plans, as if to remind them both that purpose could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. "Grandmother," she whispered to the empty room, "I wish you could tell me what to do." The sound of Silas's footsteps on the front porch interrupted her meditation. He knocked softly on the doorframe, waiting for permission to enter his own parlor, a gesture of respect that spoke to how much their relationship had evolved from its original employer-employee dynamic. "Come in," she called, closing the Bible but keeping it in her lap like an anchor. "I brought coffee," he said, carrying 2 cups and settling into the chair across from her quilting frame. "Thought you might want some company while you think things through." "Thank you." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you already know what you want to do. I think you're just scared to trust your own judgment." Eva looked at him, really looked, seeing not the imposing cattle baron who had offered her work out of impulse and guilt, but the man who had slowly learned to value relationship over reputation, who had risked social standing to protect her place in the community, who had been willing to sell his ranch rather than profit from an old injustice. "When you offered me employment that first day, what did you see in me?" Silas considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would carry weight beyond the immediate moment. "I saw someone who had been told she wasn't worth much, but who carried herself like she knew better. I saw dignity that couldn't be broken by circumstance. I saw myself, yourself, a person who needed to believe they could be worth more than their worst mistakes." The honesty of the admission hung between them like a bridge across years of regret and self-doubt. Eva understood that Silas was offering her not just his opinion about her future, but his own hard-won wisdom about the possibility of redemption. "I'm afraid," she said quietly. "Of what?" "Of failing. Of not being good enough for all the responsibility they want to give me. Of leaving here and discovering that I was only brave because you made me feel safe." Silas leaned forward, his expression gentle but firm. Eva, do you remember what you told me about your grandmother's view of forgiveness, about laying down the burden of anger to pick up the burden of love? Yes, that's what you've done for me these past months. You could have been angry about the land sale, about the connection between your family's loss and my gain. Instead, you chose to see who I was trying to become rather than who I had been. That's not just wisdom, it's courage. Eva felt tears prick her eyes, understanding that Silas was giving her permission to trust herself, to believe that the strength she had found at his ranch was truly her own, rather than something borrowed from his protection. Charles Washington is offering me a chance to do important work, she said. He's offering you a chance to do work you're already doing, just on a larger scale. You've been teaching, organizing, leading. You've just been doing it quietly in ways that didn't require you to see yourself as a leader. Eva opened her grandmother's Bible again, finding another marked passage, this time from Esther, the story of a young woman called to courage for the sake of her people. Charity Washington had marked these verses in darker ink, as if they held special significance. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? She knew, Eva said, more to herself than to Silas. What? My grandmother. She knew this moment would come somehow. She prepared me for it without telling me what I was being prepared for. Silas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. Wise women have a way of doing that. Eva stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become as familiar as family over the past months. Tomorrow, she would sign the contract that would transform her from Eva Washington, household employee, to Eva Washington, regional administrator and educator. The change in title felt less significant than the recognition of who she had always been, someone capable of growth, leadership, and making a difference in the world. I want to do it, she said finally. I want to take the position with Charles. Washington's trust. I'm proud of you, but I want to do it from here. I want Marrow Creek to be my base of operations. I want the Freedman School here to be the flagship for everything else we build. That means you're staying. That means I'm choosing to make this my home rather than just accepting it as a temporary refuge. Silas stood and joined her at the window, both of them looking out at the landscape that had witnessed their unlikely friendship, their mutual healing, their growth from wounded strangers into something approaching family. Margaret would have loved you, he said quietly. I wish I could have known her. You do know her. Every choice you've made to see possibility instead of limitation, every time you've chosen courage over safety, that's her spirit living on. Eva pressed her grandmother's Bible against her chest, feeling the accumulated prayers and hopes of generations of women who had faced impossible choices with faith instead of fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, in the house where she had learned her own worth, surrounded by the evidence of love freely given and gratefully received, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. 6 months later, Eva stood in the doorway of the newly completed Marrow Creek Freedman School, watching as children of all colors bent over their lessons with the focused intensity of young minds discovering the transformative power of education. The morning sun streamed through tall windows that had been positioned to catch every available ray of light, illuminating faces that glowed with the particular satisfaction that comes from learning something new. The completed quilt hung on the wall behind the teacher's desk, the blue and green wedding ring pattern she had worked on through those long winter evenings, finally finished and given its place of honor in the school that had become the centerpiece of her new life. Each ring in the pattern represented something different now, the interconnectedness of the community they were building, the way individual stories could be woven together to create something stronger and more beautiful than any single narrative. Miss Eva, called 8-year-old Timothy Chen, Bobby's nephew, raising his hand with the confident gesture of a child who had learned that his questions were welcome. Why do the mountains look different colors at different times of day? Eva smiled, moving between the desks with the easy authority of someone who had discovered that teaching was less about having all the answers and more about nurturing curiosity. What do you think, Timothy? What have you observed about the light and the mountains? As the boy considered his response, Eva caught sight of Silas through the window, riding up to the hitching post with the steady bearing of a man who had found purpose in his later years. He had aged well over the past months, the lines around his eyes speaking more of laughter shared than burdens carried. His weekly visits to the school had become a treasured routine, bringing not just financial support, but the kind of engaged interest that made students feel their work mattered to the wider community. Miss Washington, called Maria Santos, one of the older students who had joined the school after hearing about its innovative approach to education. Mr. Charles is here. Eva looked toward the door, where Charles Washington stood with his usual quiet dignity, his monthly visits having become as predictable as the changing seasons. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio that she knew contained reports from the other schools they had established across the territory. Progress reports that consistently exceeded their most optimistic projections. "Class," Eva announced, "please continue with your reading. Mr. Washington and I need to review some important documents." Outside, the three of them, Eva, Silas, and Charles, settled into chairs on the school's front porch where they could observe the bustling activity of a community that had embraced change with surprising enthusiasm. The prejudices that had once seemed insurmountable hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been significantly eroded by the simple reality of progress made visible. "The Kansas City School is requesting additional funding for a library," Charles reported, consulting his notes. "The Denver program wants to add vocational training for older students, and we've received 3 new requests for schools in smaller communities." "What's our current financial position?" Eva asked, though she already knew the answer. The trust fund, carefully managed and supplemented by ongoing donations from supporters throughout the territory, had grown rather than diminished over the past months. "Strong enough to approve all the requests," Silas answered. "The cattle sales this spring exceeded expectations, and the additional donors we've recruited are proving remarkably generous." Eva marveled at how naturally the three of them had fallen into this collaborative relationship. The idealistic heir seeking to honor his family's legacy, the practical rancher learning to measure success in terms of lives changed, rather than profits accumulated, and herself bridging the gap between vision and implementation with skills she was still discovering she possessed. "There's something else," Charles said, his expression growing more serious. "I received a letter from the Territorial Governor's office. They're considering our proposal for a teacher's college." The teacher's college had been Eva's most ambitious idea, a permanent institution that could train educators specifically for the challenges of frontier communities, where students might speak 3 different languages and come from radically different backgrounds. The proposal had been submitted months earlier with little hope of serious consideration. "And," Silas prompted, "they want to fund it. Full funding for the first 5 years, with the possibility of permanent territorial support if we can demonstrate success." Eva felt the familiar flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension that accompanied each new opportunity. The teacher's college would require her to recruit faculty, develop advanced curriculum, manage a much larger budget, and navigate the political complexities of territorial higher education. "They want me to serve as the founding president," she added quietly. "Of course they do," Silas said with satisfaction. "You've proven you can turn ambitious ideas into practical realities." As they discussed the implications and requirements of this new venture, Eva reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 9 months earlier, she had stood outside Silas's stable, believing herself worth very little, hoping only for honest work and a place to rest. Now she was being offered the opportunity to lead an institution that could influence education across the entire territory. The transformation hadn't been sudden or simple. It had come through hundreds of small moments, successfully teaching a struggling student to read, mediating a conflict between families with different cultural traditions, standing up to community members who questioned her authority, learning to trust her own judgment in matters both practical and philosophical. "I want to accept," she said finally. "But I want to do it the same way we've done everything else, as a team effort with input from all of you." Charles smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." As evening approached and the students departed for their homes, Eva found herself alone, with Silas on the school's front porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the satisfaction of work well done and plans carefully made. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "giving up so much of your fortune for this project?" "Eva," Silas said gently, "I spent 5 years after Margaret's death believing I had lost everything that mattered. You taught me that the only way to truly lose everything is to stop believing you can build something worthwhile." She reached over and squeezed his hand, understanding that their relationship had evolved into something rare and precious. Not quite family, not quite friendship, but something that encompassed the best aspects of both. "Thank you," she said. "Simply, for what? For seeing worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself." As the stars began to appear over the Wyoming mountains, Eva Washington, teacher, administrator, leader, and woman of undeniable worth, contemplated a future bright with possibility. The quilted pattern of her life had grown more complex and beautiful than she had ever imagined possible, each new thread strengthening the whole while adding its own unique contribution to the design. Sometimes the smallest words could indeed break the biggest hearts, but sometimes, Eva had learned, they could also heal them, transform them, and inspire them to create something beautiful enough to last for generations.